She sees the rose before she reaches the latch, a red flare on the gate, stem trimmed clean, thorns left honest, a quiet that says, "I was here without asking anything back." Nora Hale stops with her hand half raised. This is the 20th winter counted in petals and patience, someone returning to the edge of her life and never pressing past the gate. She remembers the first bloom left while she wore another man's ring, the years when duty and shyness kept her from lifting the latch. She carried each flower inside, pressed it in a book, and let its scent speak the words neither of them would. Her husband was kind, and then gone, buried before spring, and still the rose kept appearing, the same careful cut, the same patient placement. She could not open the door because grief felt like a second vow, and answering one love would betray them both. Tonight, the rose is warm against the iron when she lifts it, like the hand that set it down has just withdrawn. A thorn kisses her fingertip, a bead of blood bright as a seal on a letter she has waited years to send. Beyond the fence, something shifts, leather easing, a horse exhaling, the soft scuff of a boot that knows how to move without being heard. And her heart answers with a hard pull that shakes loose every winter. She thinks of the signs he left that were not the flower. A sack of feed leaned against her porch in the lean year. A ledger balanced when her purse came up light, and the owner swore it must have been a bookkeeping angel. A boot track by the gate with a crooked nail print that returned each winter like a signature. He never knocked, never called her name, never pressed his claim where the town could see, and she understands now that the roses were not a plea but a promise, a way of saying, "I will not cross your threshold until you open it yourself." She stands with the bloom in one hand and the latch in the other, and feels her life narrow to the hinge. A widow measuring courage in chores decides that a man who waited 20 winters has already proved more than speech could carry. Her breath knots, pulse drums. She thinks of the girl before vows and funerals, who loved a boy with a quiet jaw and steady hands, who watched him walk away because the world had already chosen, and she knows the only choice left is hers. She brings the rose to her chest, feels the weight, and sets it in crook of the latch like a witness. Then she turns the handle. Metal groans low, old wood yields, and cold air slips across her ankles as the door opens wider than it ever has for anyone not bound to her by blood. She keeps it open, wide enough for a life to step through, and speaks to the dark, telling whoever waits beyond the fence that if he is near, this is the answer he has waited for. A shape lifts from the cottonwoods, hat brim tipping, a horse shaking its mane, and sounds carry years. Stirrup leather, a boot settling, a man drawing one long breath before stepping toward what he has held in his heart. Nora does not step back. She leaves the door open, lamplight on her face. When the figure starts toward her, slow and deliberate, fear fails, and something gentler takes its place. The weight of a hand steadying a long climb. 20 winters end at the threshold, the rose watching, the night giving way. And she holds quiet as the man who waited crosses the yard and reaches the gate. He pauses where the roses always lay, one gloved hand brushing the gatepost as though touching the memory of every winter that brought him here. Nora stands in the doorway, heart pounding loud enough she swears he must hear it, the lamplight throwing her shadow across the yard, and for a moment neither of them moves. She takes in what 20 winters have carved into him, the height and breadth still there, but heavier now with years. His shoulders stooped not in weakness but in weight carried too long, his face weathered into lines that speak of storms, distance, and a patience almost unearthly. He removes his hat, fingers lingering at the brim, and lifts his gaze to her, and it is then she sees that his eyes, though older, are the same, steady, dark as earth after rain, watching her with the same silent vow that once pulled her through her girlhood. No words cross the distance, only breath streaming pale in the cold. The rose she pressed to her chest trembles against her heart, as if it knows the hand that left it now waits for answer. She thinks of the girl she was, barefoot in the meadow when she first saw him, a quiet ranch hand too poor to ask for her but too proud to forget her. And she thinks of the woman she became, who chose duty, who lost her husband, who never stopped glancing at the gate come winter. Her daughter stirs upstairs, the creak of floorboards like a warning, but Nora does not turn her head. The moment belongs only to the two of them, bound by 2 decades of silence. He takes a step closer, boots sinking into the thawing earth. And though he is close enough now for lamplight to catch the scar at his jaw and the silver at his temples, he does not yet cross. It is as if he waits for her word, for her to open not just the door, but herself. The wind pushes at the hinges, the candle flickers, and Nora finds her voice, low and breaking. She tells him she kept every rose, pressed flat in books, hidden in boxes, carried like secret vows. She tells him she wondered if it was pity, if it was torment, if it was love, but never asked, never dared. And he answers not with flourish, but with the slow lowering of his hat to his chest, his voice deep, rough with dust and years. He left them so she would never doubt that one man's love outlived time itself. She grips the doorframe, breath catching as the weight of 2 decades presses into this hour. And she knows she cannot step back into the life of silence she held. She moves 1 foot onto the porch, her hand still clutching the rose, her eyes on him with tears sharp as glass. "Then why," she whispers, "did you never knock?" His lips twitch, almost a smile, but softer, wounded. "Because you were not ready to open." The truth of it cuts her and heals her all at once, and she stands trembling at the threshold between past and what waits. Behind her, the lamp hums. Before her, the man who never let go stands steady at the gate. And as the night holds its breath, she knows this winter is different, because the door is already open. And so is she. The yard is still, snowflakes tumbling in slow spirals, the two of them held in a silence thicker than any words could bridge. Nora grips the rose so tight its stem bends, the thorn pressing against her palm, a small sting to remind her this is real. For 20 winters she imagined what she might say if ever the man behind the roses stood before her, and now her tongue feels dry, her chest heavy. He steps closer, the creak of the gate carrying into the night, and when he speaks, his voice is low, steady, the same cadence that once carried over meadows when he called cattle, but now softened for her alone. He tells her he never left the county, never married, never forgot. He worked land that was not his, fought storms and lean years, but every winter he returned to this gate, because this was where his heart had stayed. His eyes flicker to the rose she holds, and something breaks in her, grief, guilt, longing, all tangled. She tells him she saw the roses each year but could not answer, that her husband's grave felt like an anchor and her duty like a chain. Her voice cracks as she admits she feared opening the door would betray the life she had chosen, even if it was gone. He nods, not with anger, but with the quiet understanding of a man who has carried his own chains, and he says her silence was answer enough that he would have left if her heart had told him to. But the roses were never refused, never thrown back, and so he stayed, giving her time to choose. Above them a floorboard creaks, and Nora stiffens. Her daughter's shadow moves across the window, curious, protective, and Nora feels a flush of shame. What will she think? seeing her mother stand in the night with a man whose devotion has been hidden for decades. The cowboy's gaze follows hers, and he asks softly if the girl knows. Nora shakes her head, saying she never told her, never dared to weave hope into their days when she could not see the end of it. His jaw tightens, not in judgment but in pain, because he knows the years have not only cost him, they have shaped her daughter's life as well. Nora steps forward onto the porch, her breath turning white, her heart hammering. She tells him she cannot erase the winters behind them, but she can no longer bear another one with the door closed. His eyes glisten, the first crack in his weathered face, and he lowers his hat, saying that he came each year not for her thanks, not for claim, but because love unspoken was still love worth living. Her tears spill, hot against the cold night, as she whispers that she should have opened the door long ago. He shakes his head, a faint smile ghosting his lips. "It had to be tonight," he says, as if the 20 winters were written into the earth itself, waiting for this moment. The door yawns wide behind her, lamplight spilling out, and for the first time she steps back, not to close it, but to invite him in. He hesitates at the threshold, as if the choice belongs entirely to her, and Nora feels the weight of her daughter's gaze still watching from above. Her hand trembles on the frame, the rose trembling with it, and she whispers, "Come in." The words break the spell of silence, and with a slow breath he crosses the porch, his boots heavy, deliberate, as if every step carries 20 years of love finally allowed a place inside. The door shut behind them with a soft groan, the lamplight pressing back the cold as Nora led him into the small cabin that carried every mark of her years alone. And for a moment, she felt the strangeness of a man's presence filling the room after so long, his boots leaving dark prints on the floor, his hat held respectfully in his hands, his eyes scanning not with judgment, but with the quiet reverence of someone finally allowed into a sacred place he had waited half his life to enter. Yet before either could speak, the stairs creaked, and her daughter descended, hair loose from sleep, her young face shadowed by suspicion, her gaze flicking from her mother to the stranger with sharpness that cut the room in two, and Nora's breath caught because she had prayed this moment would not come before she found words to explain. But the girl's voice broke the silence with a demand sharper than any blade, asking who he was and why he stood in their home at this hour, her tone protective, almost accusatory, and Nora's heart twisted between shame and pride as she saw in her daughter the same fire she herself once carried. The cowboy straightened, his posture neither defensive nor ashamed, and he said with quiet steadiness that he was a man who had waited 20 winters at this gate, and had come only when the door was opened, his eyes never leaving Nora's as he spoke, though his words were meant for the daughter too, and the girl's brows furrowed, confusion and anger tangling as she turned on her mother, asking what he meant, what roses, what secret had been hidden while she grew up with nothing but the sound of the wind against their shutters each year. Nora's voice faltered as she confessed the truth, that every winter without fail a rose had been left for her, that she had kept them all pressed in books, that the man standing before them had carried a vow across decades in silence, and she admitted she had not spoken of it because she had not been brave enough to open the door, not until tonight. And the daughter's eyes widened, disbelief and betrayal sharp in them, as she asked if all those years of grief and loneliness had been a choice, if love had been waiting outside while her mother clung to sorrow inside. The words pierced Nora, and she reached for her daughter, begging her to understand that grief had been a cage she did not know how to break. But the girl pulled back, her young face trembling with tears, whispering that her father had been honored with silence, yet she had been raised without truth. And the cowboy, steady as ever, stepped forward just enough to meet her gaze and said with gravity that no child should think herself unloved or forsaken, that he had left the roses for her mother, but never meant them to wound the daughter who grew inside the home beyond the gate, and he told her that waiting was not an act of theft, but of hope. Hope that one day love would be welcomed again. The girl's lips trembled, her anger cooling into confusion, and she looked between them, her mother weeping softly, the cowboy's face lined with years but open with honesty. And though she did not forgive, not yet, she whispered one question into the hush of the cabin. If he had waited so long, what did he want now? And the air grew heavier. Because the answer would decide if 20 winters were the beginning of something or the end. The question hung in the small cabin like smoke, her daughter's voice trembling but sharp, and Nora's pulse quickened because she feared the weight of the answer as much as she longed for it. Yet the cowboy did not rush, did not flinch beneath the young girl's gaze. He simply set his hat on the table and folded his scarred hands before him, his voice low and roughened by years of silence when he said he wanted nothing that was not freely given, that roses had been his way of keeping love alive without demanding it, that he did not ride here tonight to claim, but only to stand in truth at last. Nora felt tears prick her eyes at the steadiness of him, the humility of a man who had carried devotion like a burden and a gift both. And she wanted to speak, to tell him what those roses had meant to her through long winters of loneliness. But her daughter's jaw was set, her voice breaking as she accused him of stealing years from them both, asking why he had not spoken sooner if his love was true, and the cowboy's eyes softened as he said he could not step through a door that was closed, that he feared pressing would tarnish what was pure. So he let time itself be the test, and the girl turned away, struggling to hold her tears. Nora reached for her, saying she had never meant to hide love from her, that she had clung to grief because it felt safer than hope. But she was opening the door now, for herself and for her daughter too, because life without hope was only half a life. The girl pressed her hands to her face, torn between anger and longing, and Nora wrapped her arms around her, holding her close while her own tears fell hot against her child's hair, whispering that no man, not even her father, would want her to bury her heart forever. Slowly, hesitantly, the girl let herself sink into her mother's embrace, though her eyes still flicked to the cowboy with guarded suspicion. He did not push, did not plead, only said gently that he had watched her grow from afar, never close enough to steal her father's place, but always near enough to be sure she was safe, that his roses were for her mother, but his watchfulness was for them both. The girl stiffened, startled, as if realizing the quiet presence that had lingered on the edges of their lives had been no stranger after all. And though words failed her, her tears betrayed the knot inside her chest. The fire crackled in the hearth, shadows swaying across the walls. And Nora looked at him with all the weight of 20 winters pressing through her eyes, asking with a whisper what he wanted now that the door was open, and he met her gaze steady, unflinching, and said he wanted only to share what years remained, to give them both a life not built on silence but on presence, on mornings with bread and evenings with firelight, on laughter when it came and comfort when it was needed, that he did not come for possession but for belonging. Nora's heart broke and healed in the same beat, and she pressed her forehead to her daughter's temple, whispering that sometimes love waited because it had no other way to survive. And the girl's trembling slowed, her breath evening, as if she could feel through their closeness that the truth, though heavy, carried no chains. And when she lifted her head again, her tearful eyes settled on him, searching, still uncertain, but less hardened than before, and she whispered that if his words were true, he would prove them not in roses at the gate, but in the life he lived inside their door. The girl's words struck like a verdict, her young voice shaking but steady, And in the silence that followed, Nora felt her breath catch because it wasn't anger anymore that filled the cabin, but something harder to face. Expectation, the demand that he show in living what he had claimed in waiting. The cowboy bowed his head, not with shame, but with respect, as if the challenge was one he had long rehearsed. And when he lifted his eyes again, they held no fire of protest, only the calm of a man who understood vows were not proven in speeches, but in days endured. He set his hat on the peg by the door, as if to mark his willingness to stay, then asked quietly if he might sit, his tone so gentle that even the girl, though stiff, nodded, and Nora led them both to the table worn smooth by years of solitude. The lamplight flickered over their faces as he folded his scarred hands before him, and Nora saw how rough they were, marked by rope and rain, yet steady in their stillness. And she felt her heart twist at the thought that such hands had carried roses instead of weapons, year after year, in silence. Her daughter leaned against her, eyes red, voice thin as she asked him why he had chosen roses, not words. And he smiled faintly, the first sign of warmth breaking through the quiet weight of him. And he said that roses were the only thing beautiful enough to carry what he felt without demanding it back. That in each bloom was a piece of his patience, a reminder that love did not vanish with rejection, only waited for a season to be received. Nora's throat tightened at the simplicity of it, because she had clutched those roses in her darkest nights, never knowing that the patience she felt from them was his own heart pressed into her palm. The girl looked away, torn between skepticism and the ache of wanting to believe, and the cowboy did not press, only turned to Nora and said softly that he had dreamed of this table, of being invited not as a ghost at the gate, but as a man who could share bread and fire with her. She reached for his hand across the wood, her touch hesitant, her fingers trembling, and when he let her take it, she felt the years collapse between them, her heart racing with both grief and relief, because she had buried love once and never thought it would breathe again. Her daughter watched, her lips pressing tight, but she did not pull away this time. Instead, she whispered that if he meant to stay, he must not only love her mother but protect them both when the world pressed hard, because life on the frontier did not spare tenderness. His gaze met hers, unwavering, and he nodded with the solemnity of a vow, saying that he had waited 20 winters for the door, and now that it was open he would never stand outside again. The fire crackled louder, the walls closing them into a circle of warmth, and for the first time in decades, the cabin did not feel hollow. Nora leaned back, the rose still in her lap, its petals glowing red in the lamplight, and she felt something she had not allowed herself in years. Hope, fragile but fierce, blooming like the first green shoot under snow. And as she held her daughter close with one arm and his hand with the other, she realized that perhaps the hardest winters were already behind them. And what came next would be lived together, not in silence but in shared fire. When dawn slipped through the shutters, it found Nora already awake, her hand resting on the rose still lying by her bedside, the stem bruised from her grip, yet the petals as soft as when she first lifted it from the gate. The cabin felt different, not because the walls had changed, but because silence had shifted. Instead of emptiness, it held the steady rhythm of another man's breath downstairs, the low scrape of a chair against the floor, the scent of coffee rising from the hearth, where he had kindled a fire before she stirred. For 20 winters she had risen alone, her daughter's soft footsteps the only other sound in the house. But now the air carried the weight of presence, and her heart beat faster with both comfort and fear. She dressed quickly, her fingers fumbling at the laces, and descended the stairs to find him standing by the stove, sleeves rolled, tending a skillet as if the kitchen had been his all along. He glanced up when she entered, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, his eyes catching her in the same steady way they had the night before. And for a moment she forgot how to breathe. He said nothing more than a soft good morning, his voice quiet enough not to wake the girl still sleeping. Yet it wrapped around her like a warmth she had not felt in years. She watched him move, the care he gave each small act, the way he set a plate as though it mattered, the way he poured coffee without spilling a drop. And she realized he was already proving what words never could, that love measured itself not in declarations, but in the patience of daily things. When her daughter finally came down, hair tangled, eyes wary, she froze at the sight of him seated at their table, steam curling from a second cup set ready for her. For a long moment she hovered by the stairs, caught between the instinct to retreat and the yearning to belong to the new rhythm already beginning. He did not force her, only inclined his head in greeting, and after a hesitation that stretched thin, she crossed the room and sat opposite him, her back stiff, her eyes flicking to Nora for guidance. Nora reached across the table and took her daughter's hand, whispering that nothing was being taken, that no memory of her father was erased, but that the winters had been too long and life too short to turn away from what had waited so faithfully. The girl swallowed hard, tears threatening again. But she forced herself to meet the cowboy's gaze and said, if he meant to share their table, he must be willing to carry more than roses. He must carry the weight of them both. He nodded once, slow and firm, and replied that a man's vow meant nothing if it did not protect the ones he loved, and that his years of silence had been the proving ground for the years ahead. The girl looked away, still tangled in doubt, but when she lifted the fork he had set before her and took a bite, it was the first step towards acceptance. Nora felt her chest loosen, hope blooming cautious but real. The rose lay between them on the table, its red petals glowing in the morning light, and she knew it was no longer only a token of what had been lost. It was a beginning, fragile as dawn, yet strong enough to carry them into what was to come. Word spread faster than wind across the prairie, and by the week's end the town had already noticed that Nora's door, once shut through every winter, now stayed open long after sundown, a lamplight glow spilling onto the snow where for 20 years a single rose had rested. And when she walked to market with her daughter at her side, the cowboy was there too, his stride steady, his silence no longer hidden at the edge of her land, but carried openly beside her, and the weight of the townsfolk's eyes pressed heavy, though no one spoke. She had lived half her life under their watch, the widow who carried grief like armor, and now she felt their whispers like stones, wondering if she had betrayed her husband's grave or broken some unspoken rule. Yet when she glanced at the man who had waited 2 decades with patience carved deeper than any law, she felt no shame, only the ache of having wasted so much time. At the market he carried her sacks without being asked. He tipped his hat to those who glared. And when her daughter bristled at a muttered remark, his hand touched her shoulder lightly, steadying her with a calm that said, "Not all battles are fought with fists." That night by the fire, Nora asked him why he endured their stares with such quiet, and he answered simply that love was never meant to be proven to a crowd, only to the ones who shared your table, and the words cut straight through her fear, leaving her trembling with gratitude and sorrow that she had denied him so long. Her daughter listened in silence, then finally asked if he had ever hated her for making him wait, and his eyes softened as he told her that waiting had not been suffering. It had been living with hope, and hope had kept him alive more than bread or fire. The girl looked away, struggling with the truth. But when Nora saw her fingers ease from their tight grip on her skirt, she knew some part of her daughter's heart had begun to shift. Later, when they stood at the window together, the snow falling soft, Nora asked him what he saw when he looked at the years ahead, and he said he saw the same porch, the same fire, the same hands, hers, worn but steady, no longer behind a door but beside him, and the vision filled her with both fear and fierce longing. She pressed her palm to the glass, the cold biting her skin, and whispered that she wished she had opened the door sooner. And he touched his hand to hers on the other side, the heat of him searing through the pain, and murmured that love knows no wasted time, only time still to be lived. At that, Nora let herself breathe fully for the first time in 20 winters, and though the town's eyes would not dim, she realized they no longer held the power to close her door again. Snow melted into mud as spring pushed its way across the valley, and with it came a quiet unlike any Nora had known in years. Not the silence of emptiness, but of peace, settling into the bones of her home. Yet even as she learned to breathe with his presence at her table, she felt the weight of one question left unspoken. Would the roses continue now that the door was open? Or had the ritual ended with her choice? She thought of it each evening when the gate creaked in the wind, when the sun dipped behind the ridge, and though her hands were busy with bread and her daughter's laughter slowly returned, her heart waited for a sign. One night she found him in the yard, mending the fence by lantern glow. His shoulders bowed over the post, his movements steady and unhurried, and she asked, voice barely above the wind, if there would be another rose when winter came again. He paused, setting his tools aside, and when he lifted his head, his eyes caught the lantern light, soft and unwavering, and he said that the roses had been for a woman behind a closed door, that each bloom was a promise he would wait until she was ready. But now that she had opened it, the time for roses at the gate was done, for he would bring them inside where they belonged. Her chest tightened at the words, sorrow and joy tangled, because she realized the ritual she had clung to as proof of love was being replaced by the greater proof of presence, and she whispered that she feared the world without those tokens. But he crossed the yard and took her hands in his rough palms, pressing them to his chest, telling her that she would never again wake wondering if love still waited. For it was here, breathing with her, sharing her fire, planting itself deeper than petals that wilted in a week. Behind them her daughter stood at the porch, watching, and for the first time her face carried no suspicion, only quiet acceptance, as if the months of shared work and steady kindness had melted her doubt. She came forward slowly, placing a small bundle in her mother's hand. A book that had lain hidden in Nora's chest, its pages filled with 20 pressed roses, flattened but still faintly fragrant, the years of silence preserved in fragile blooms. The girl looked at him and said that if he meant to stay, he should see what his patience had left behind, and Nora opened the book with shaking fingers, showing him each rose, each winter marked in silence, each petal that had steadied her in loneliness. His eyes misted as he traced one bloom with a calloused finger, and his voice, thick with emotion, said that love had endured because she had kept them, not because he had left them, that together they had carried the vow even when apart. Nora leaned into him, the book clutched between them, and for the first time she felt not the weight of debt but the freedom of choice, the truth that what they held was no longer born of waiting, but of living. The lantern flickered, the night pressed close, and as her daughter stepped back into the cabin with a small smile, Nora let herself rest against the man who had waited 20 winters and whispered that the last rose had finally found its home. The first summer after the long winter of change brought fields alive with wildflowers, bright colors scattering across the prairie like promises the earth itself had been saving. And for Nora the sight carried a weight deeper than beauty, for each bloom reminded her of the roses once left at her gate and the years she had wasted behind a locked door. Yet now the gate swung free in the wind, never chained, never waiting, and the man who had once stood in shadows worked openly by her side, mending fences, tending stock, sharing the burden she had carried alone for too long. Her daughter, once wary, now laughed again, her voice carrying across the yard as she joined in chores, her eyes no longer guarded but steady, as if she had accepted that love was not betrayal to memory, but a way of honoring it. Each night they shared supper by the fire, and sometimes he would reach into his saddlebag and lay a rose on the table, not at the gate but before her eyes, a gesture not of waiting but of presence, and she would press it to her lips with tears that were no longer bitter. As the seasons turned, townsfolk still whispered, but Nora learned to meet their stares with quiet strength, knowing that her life was no longer measured by their judgment, but by the hands that now built her days. One evening, near the edge of autumn, she found herself at the door as the sun bled gold across the horizon, the same door she had once feared to open, and she realized it would never close again. Not truly, because the man she had waited to welcome was no longer a ghost, but a partner in every breath. She turned and saw him leaning on the fence, watching the land with the calm of someone who had finally come home, and her heart swelled with a love that outlived roses, a love that had survived silence and time. She walked to him, pressing her hand into his, and together they stood as dusk swallowed the prairie, her daughter lighting a lamp inside, the glow spilling through the open door like a beacon. Nora thought of all the winters that had come before, the petals pressed into books, the ache of loneliness, and she whispered into the wind that those years were not wasted after all, for they had taught her the worth of the moment now. The cowboy squeezed her hand, his voice low, saying that patience had been his gift, but love was hers to give. And she looked up at him with tears shining and answered that she gave it freely, at last. Behind them, the door stood open, a symbol no storm could shut, and the rose he had placed on the table glowed in the lamplight, its petals soft against the page of a book left open, as if to say the story was still being written. And as the stars blinked awake overhead, Nora knew that the vow carried through 20 winters had not ended at her threshold. It had only just begun.